Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are watching us on YouTube, you can also carry the Lunch Hour with you on one of the many fine podcast platforms. Wherever you find podcasts, you're going to find the Lunch Hour. If you're listening to us on one of those platforms, you can always watch us to see what's happening in studio. Go and check us out on YouTube. Leave a review, subscribe, all of those things that the hip kids do to make sure that they're supporting their podcasts. Please go ahead and do that. We got a great guest this week. Very excited to talk to him. A colleague of mine for many, many years. His name is Vincent Vernuccio, Vinnie Vernuccio, as I call him. He's the president and co-founder of the Institute for the American Worker, bringing over 15 years of expertise in labor law and policy. He's held significant roles in public policy, including serving as the director of labor policy at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and is a senior fellow at both the Illinois Policy Institute and the aforementioned Mackinac Center. He also served as a senior policy advisor for various free market organizations, such as the State Policy Network and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is where I first met Vinnie many, many moons ago. His career includes notable positions in government, having served under President George W. Bush as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Administration and Management at the Department of Labor. He was also a member of the Trump administration's labor transition team. I don't have your undergraduate degree here, Vinnie, but I believe you went to Ave Maria School of Law. Is that right?
Went to Ave when I was in Michigan and went to a little college in upstate New York called SUNY Oneonta.
There you
baseball
go.
Fans out there, it was half an hour outside
excellent. And it's so funny because I was just talking to our colleague, Jerry Rogers, doing our other podcast that Jerry and I do together. And he said something, we'll get to more of this stuff, the outside interest at the end. But your dad was involved in public policy and is now retired to Throg's Neck?
Yeah, he's up in the Bronx with Jerry. And Jerry, good guy. Please tell him I said hi. And yeah, he actually does a bunch of radio and news himself, both on national issues, not labor. He leaves that to me, but also on local New York issues as well.
Did you? And you grew up there?
I grew up in Manhattan. So, the real city. Lived in 12-story building in an apartment.
Where'd you go to high school?
Loyola High School.
Have you and I have never had this conversation because I grew up just north of the city. I don't know how we didn't, we've never, in the many years we've known each other, I don't know how we haven't had this conversation. I'm getting ready to head up to the city this weekend. That's neither here nor there. The point is, folks, since I've known Vinnie, he's worked on these labor issues and rightly so, given his talents and his expertise, has risen up to now being president of the Institute for the American Worker. Tell us about that organization because it's not new. It's been around for a couple of years, but you saw a need. And by the way, we're recording this a couple of weeks before Labor Day, but I wanted to have this discussion around Labor Day because there is this misimpression that the unions are the only one who represents American workers in the discussion here. Clearly, there's something missing. That's what the Institute for the American Worker aims to bridge the gap of. Talk about that.
Well, first, if this is a delayed broadcast and you are listening to this at the end of August, happy Worker Freedom Day, everyone. Hope you go out, you celebrate, have a barbecue, and celebrate worker freedom on this end of August. So Institute for the American Worker, we do federal labor policy, and our goal is full freedom for everyone in the workplace. When it comes to federal labor law, we're talking about mostly private sector employees here. We educate Congress and stakeholders and policy folks on worker freedom and bringing modern labor policy for a modern workforce and letting people that want to work for themselves do so and giving workers the ability to say, yeah, this union is doing a good job. I want the representation. I want to pay them. Or no, actually, they're not. And I want to represent myself, or I don't want to be forced into paying an organization against my will. And I know we're going to get into a lot more of the nitty gritty that's going on in Congress, some potential for the next administration. But in a nutshell, that's what we do. We believe in full freedom for all workers. And I4AW at I4AW.org. that is our main focus.
And we're going to come back to the link later on. I'll going to give you more than another opportunity to do this. But let's talk about some of that nitty gritty. I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast, is to get down into it. The first, not that we want to get into the partisan side of it, but let's talk about the current administration, the Biden-Harris administration, and the issue of the concept of good jobs and how they define good jobs. Now, I'm someone who literally, I have a policy job that I do, and then I have a couple of different media jobs that I do, and I like that flexibility. But the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration would say, well, these are not good jobs. Talk about this, and talk about this issue of you being able to choose what it is you want to do and how you want to do it.
So, I mean, that is the main problem with the Biden-Harris administration, between their Department of Labor independent contractor rule, some of the things that are coming out of the National Labor Relations Board, like their joint employer rule, or even the decisions that are doing on independent contracting, to Congress, where they have a thing called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And what the goal of all of these actions are is they want workers in a box. They want workers to be employees of big corporations that can be taxed, can be regulated, and can be organized. What they don't want is essentially where the workforce is going. That's independence, that's flexibility, that's being able to choose what kind of work is best for you. If you want to be an independent contractor, you should be. If you want to work for, several different small businesses, you should have that ability. But unfortunately, Biden administration and their partners in Congress are making that increasingly difficult.
But it's a situation, right, where so many people in America want to do this work in this way. It seems to defy what the public wants. There's an overarching principle at work for the Biden-Harris administration and their progressive adherents. What's the overarching principle? If they're doing this against the wishes of all of these workers, what's the goal?
Well, the goal is, once again, to put them in a box. It's to make sure that they're easily regulated.
My point is, who benefits from this, Vinnie? That's I guess what I'm asking here.
And so who benefits is so they can be unionized. You see the unions pushing things like the AB5 in California that decimated the independent contractors out there. And on the website, i4aw.org, we actually have stories from independent contractors who lost their livelihoods, or in some cases actually moved out of state because of these attacks on independent work. Now, thankfully, voters in California said, no, you've gone too far. And even the bill sponsor of AB5 said we went too far, and they started to do all these exemptions and essentially gutted the law. But what we're seeing out of Congress with the PRO Act, and what we're seeing out of the regulations and case decisions at the Department of Labor and the National Labor Relations Board, is they're trying to do either the same type of tests or cause the same type of outcome, even if they say, well, we're not doing the same test. And that would decimate independent work across the country.
And let's, it's interesting, right? Because we talk about this freedom issue, and I'm going to ask you in a minute about non-compete clauses, because that's interesting to me. But, it just seems to me that let's take a hypothetical 53-year-old man. And this man, lives, a couple of hours away from a big city, can do a lot of work remotely. I want to do this. I'm sorry, Vinnie. I want to be really clear. I want to make this hypothetical. That hypothetical man makes these choices because it fits
hypothetical, very good looking, very well-spoken man that may be going to New York, and I hope getting a slice of pizza, a hot dog, and a bagel. That's
exactly right. And it has the flexibility to say, I'm going to take a Friday off to drive my family to Newark Airport, and do all of those things. So what happens if my employer, I want to do this, and my employer wants to do this, but the law says otherwise? What was the penalty in California? What are the penalties for a business that sort of flouts this law, at the national level, from the Department of Labor or the NLRB or what have you? What are the risks that such a person runs by firmly remaining, I want to remain an independent contractor?
So they call it as employment misclassification. And you could be hit with all sorts of penalties and fines and taxes and a lot of issues, even if everybody agrees. And I mean, that's the problem. What you have is, you had, let's just say gig economies like Uber and Lyft. You have, most of the drivers, they want the flexibility. They want to be able to say, yeah, I want to start working. When my kids go to school, I want to be done by the time they get home. And then maybe, I'm going to go after they go to sleep or something like that. And I want to be an independent contractor for that flexibility. Now, thankfully, the gig economies, they're, separate from that law now, but they would have actually had to change their entire business model, increase liability, increase taxes. And for a lot of people that were working for themselves, they would either be, you're an employee or, you're not working with us. And that's just a hypothetical. In reality, you look at a lot of the people like independent writers or even people in media, and they're a freelance writer or working on film and stuff like that, and they actually almost lost their livelihood. I mean, in fact, you see some very left-leaning organizations that actually had to end contracts with freelance writers and independent contractors, and all these people that were frankly championing this policy just got a rude awakening and said, wait, this affects me. And it does when you go after independent work.
So let me ask you this, right? Because again, and you raised this early on in talking about the gap that the Institute for the American Worker seeks to fill. It's 2024. And the workplace and workplaces and the economy has changed drastically in the last 100 years, right? Since Jack Reed was setting up the IWW, the Wobblies, the workplace and workplaces are very different. And the way we look at compensation and sort of the package that has changed, but the law doesn't quite recognize that. It's funny. Not one of my first jobs, but one of my jobs in DC, I had a colleague tell me. Now, I was an employee of this business, and I had a colleague talk to me about sort of the structure. And this was an organization that paid staffers a little less than other organizations paid. He said, but the difference is the quality of life here is really good. And I put a monetary value on my job satisfaction rate of X number of dollars. And the idea is, how much more of my salary would someone have to pay me in order for me to take a different job? And when that number reaches zero, or God forbid, goes to a point where I'm literally willing to pay somebody to take me away from this place, then I know I need to leave. And we seem to the leftist labor movement doesn't seem to understand this. They want everything to be done in terms of wages and hours. I mean, we have a wage and hour division of the Department of Labor. They don't understand the intangibles, and that people accept jobs at different wage rates because of their desires. Am I missing something here? Or how can we catch up with the modern life? And do they don't want us to catch up with modern life, do they?
Well, let's talk about tangible. So, leave, job satisfaction, quality aside for 1 second.
Yeah.
But that is kind of you hit the nail on the head of kind of the outdated model of current labor law, and frankly, the vastly outdated model of collective bargaining and what unions are striving for. Unions are stuck in this turn of this last century industrial revolution, one size fits all adversarial business model that frankly most workers today don't want. And that's why I think workers are consistently, rejecting unions, and you see their percentage of the workforce dropping drastically. Frankly, I do see a place for unions if they embrace a voluntary business model and become like professional service organizations. But unfortunately, they're not there. And, what we see is these one size fits all contracts where you are forced, if you're under a union contract, to take not just the representation, but you're stuck with the wages, the benefits, and the vacations, the hours off that they negotiate for you. And it's actually impossible for the employer to unilaterally say, you know what, you're doing a great job, I'm going to give you a raise, or I'm going to give you a bonus. Or, hey, you want to make you want more vacation for a little less money? Yeah, let's just talk and act like the over 96% of the rest of the economy, or 94% of the rest of the economy, that's not union.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing being doubled down with the policies coming out of the Biden administration, coming out of Congress, is they want everyone in these kind of one-size-fits-all contracts for unions. And most workers are saying, no, I want the flexibility, or I want to be rewarded individually for how hard I work. I want to work directly with my client or my boss.
And this gets into the same issue of the so-called wage gaps between men and women, or between African Americans and other people, or different people come to a position with different ideas as to what they want to get paid and how they want that structured. And so the idea that there's some kind of a pay gap, well, that's vastly overstated, isn't it?
Well, once again, this is where it should be, what do individuals value more? Is it, I want to take time off because I want to raise my kids and then come back? Do I want to have more vacation so I can do that? Or do I want to support my family and I'm willing to work myself to the bone and I just want to be paid for that? Yeah. And if I make my boss a lot of money, I want a good bonus. And I want to know that if I'm working harder than the person next to me, that I'm going to be rewarded for doing so. But, unfortunately, what we're seeing with almost all collective bargaining agreements is that's not the way they work. This is what we have. It's kind of like, the old Henry Ford joke. You can have a Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. That's kind of at the heart of collective bargaining.
Sure. Well, let me talk about this, because this is another issue that's come up. And I don't know. I'm saying this, folks. Normally, and you should never ask questions you don't know the answer to. But I honestly don't know the answer to what the Institute for the American Worker has done on this. Where are you guys on the issue of non-compete clauses? Because I kind of come down. I get that a business where there's a proprietary interest, there's trade secrets that you should not be able to compete, right? I have more of a problem when there isn't a trade secret issue involved. Like if you work for sub company X making subs for some company X, they can't preclude you from working for sub company Y. Or if you're working for cell phone company X, they shouldn't just doing sales, right? You're just selling cell phones. You shouldn't be precluded from those. That's my opinion on this. Even to the point with doctors, right? Doctors working for different hospital systems, not being able to join another practice within 50 miles. Where's the Institute for American Worker in this? And where am I wrong in all of this, Vinnie?
Well, Andrew, if you're right, I'm going to stick with my expertise and get to a side conversation that comes up with a lot of the non-competes issues. And that's the issue of salting. And let me tell you a little bit about what salting is, if you're not familiar. Salting is a paid union organizer that goes in to take a job. They lie to their employer. They say, I just want this job. They don't tell them that they're actually being paid to get hired to essentially rabble-rouse within the workplace and try to organize a union. In a lot of cases, they lie to their fellow coworkers saying, oh, I just want a union. I'm, just like you. And don't tell them, hey, by the way, I'm being paid
Greetings,
for the union.
fellow
I got
teenagers.
paid by the union to take this job. And not only that, there's actually a union organizer that failed to disclose that when she testified before Congress and said, oh, hey, I'm just a Starbucks worker that wants to unionize. Then it came, oh, lo and behold, yeah, you're getting paid by the union to do this. Yeah. So when we're talking about some of these issues, we focus very heavily on salting. And there's another thing called a labor persuader. And those are people hired by management to talk to employees and say, this is our view on unionization. We believe that salts should be considered like these labor persuaders. If management hires someone to talk to employees and say, yes or no on unionization, they have to report that to the Department of Labor. Sure. I think if a union hires someone, has them take a job to talk to employees about unionization for or against, they should also have to file the same form. And actually, we wrote an article on this, and we've been championing Congressman Burgess Owens from Utah. He actually has a bill that simply says, hey, there should be parity. If management hires somebody to talk to workers about unionization, union should have the exact same type of requirements of transparency and accountability and talking to the Department of Labor that management does. It's a great bill by Congressman Owens. And also we have actually on i4aw.org, we have polling saying that that the public overwhelmingly supports this type of transparency when it comes to these union organizers that are actually lying to both employers and their coworkers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a situation where this issue of parity is important, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so, yeah, making sure that there is this transparency and accountability in these transactions, right? So people can make informed decisions. But part of this is the issue of, it gets into the work you and I have both done over many, many years about the nanny state sort of trying to substitute its judgment for that of a free and informed individual in society. We want people to be informed to make their own decisions. What can be wrong with that?
No, that's right, and that's where the transparency comes in. Now, I mean, if you want to do the purely libertarian standpoint, and I know some libertarians, talk about right to work and some of these issues of, why should the government be involved? And, I'll answer that directly. It's because with federal labor law, with the National Labor Relations Act, to another extent, the Railway Labor Act, government is so involved with labor relations. Now, if they were to take a step back and, unions didn't have all these privileges and there weren't all these extra requirements for workers and for job creators and frankly, unions as well, then yeah, let's take a really super libertarian view of all this. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And because there is so many government obligations and requirements and privileges that go to one side as opposed to the other, then there has to be more to even out the playing field until we get to the point where, those government regulations are ratcheted back.
Well, I mean, that's just it. I mean, just had this conversation with the aforementioned Jerry about this and having to do with trade policy. Not that I want us to spend some time trashing our small L libertarian brethren or our so-called free market limited government brethren, but there is a point where we have to deal with the real world and the real world issues that are out there. And that we have this vast body of federal labor law that is already ginned against markets and employers. And therefore, we need to work within that framework, right? It would be great if we could just wake up one day and say, okay, we have a purely free market system. We don't. I mean, you and I have seen this, both of us. Where anyway, not that I want you to trash our libertarian brethren here, but I have a real hard time with folks who don't want to deal with the real world that's in front of us, which we absolutely have to do. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the NLRB and the problems that have accrued in the last 3 years with the NLRB and decision making.
Absolutely. So let's start with the NLRB's chair, Lauren McFerrin, who is up for reappointment. President Biden actually announced her reappointment months before it expires, and it's going to still be months before it expires when this airs. It expires in December. And I know that there's a lot of people bringing out all the stops to get her reappointed, and she has some serious problems. And first, let's talk about the problems, and then we'll talk about the ramifications if she does get reappointed. So first, she has done gross mismanagement over the NLRB. There's OIG investigations. There's been a lot of people calling her management of the NLRB into question. The second issue, and before we get into the real heart of the issues that she's ruled on, is that President Biden, if he sees that Harris may not get the nod, then and it's going to be a President Trump, he's actually trying to steal an appointment away from President Trump. Because remember, at the NLRB, they serve terms. Yeah. So if McFerrin is reappointed, she serves a 5-year term, no matter who is president. Right. And not only that, but the Democrats on the board will keep a majority if she gets reappointed until the summer of 2026. Yeah. So if she doesn't get reappointed, Republicans conceivably could get into appointment and flip the NLRB early next year. But if she does get reappointed, then we could see another year and a half of Democrat, aka big labor, control the NLRB. And let me tell you about some of the disastrous opinions that have been coming out of the NLRB. First and foremost, there's a decision called CEMEX, which, if Andrew, you're familiar with card check, or this open petition process that allows for intimidation and coercion and deprives workers of the ability to get both sides of a story. Well, she doesn't go that far, but she simply says that, hey, if a union organizes that way and then the employer asks for an election, they can have the election. But if we find out the employer did something wrong, we can basically just take the rug out from under the workers and said, yeah, you voted against the union, but we're recognizing them anyway. Sure. That's CEMEX.
Right.
There's another decision. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds of the cases here, but lying elastomers. And let me tell you what this does.
Please.
This actually goes back to an old standard allowing racist and sexist harassment in the workplace, as long as it's in the furtherance of what unions want. They can actually do racist and sexist harassment of their coworkers. And hey, as long as it's in the furtherance of a union, Lauren McFerrin's NLRB has said that's okay. So, that's just a sampling of some of the bad decisions, and we're keeping a extremely close eye on her reappointment.
Wow. I don't doubt it. I mean, it's one of those things where I want to be really clear about this. Again, talking about the realistic nature of this. We all understand that there's sometimes collective bargaining has its place. And when an employer is engaging in egregious behavior, and when an employer is actually violating the law, something needs to be done about this. But the problem is when these systems are being used as political pawns that only serve to either grow the size or the coffers of one of these parties, that's a problem, isn't it?
Right. And just to go back to your libertarian point before,
right.
This isn't even about the government saying, you can't speak or you can't do this in the workplace. This is actually the government coming in and saying, hey, you employer, you want to protect your employees. You had an employee that had this just vile, nasty language and made the workplace uncomfortable. You can't discipline that employee. You can't fire them or protect your other employees. And that's kind of the heart of what this is coming down to. It's not so much, government saying what you can and can't say. It's saying that employers, you have a private business, you can't protect your fellow employees. And that's what Lauren McFerrin and her NLRB are doing with some of these decisions.
Well, let's take a step back for a second. How did you get interested in labor policy issues? I mean, my very first job in DC, I was working for some very talented labor lawyers. I found it interesting. And then I got back to working on other kinds of regulatory policy. How did you get involved in this? What sort of made it fascinating for you?
Well, I mean, I got my start in the Bush administration and got hired to the Bush Department of Labor. I'll tell you, my boss put a stack of papers this high on my desk and said, read it, learn it. I don't want to hear from you for 2 weeks, and then we'll talk about what you're doing. Nice. And, for a lot of right of center folks, that is kind of how they got their start in labor policy. So one of the things that we're doing at I4AW is we're kind of standardizing it. We're saying, no, the labor policy, the union issue is huge. And, you see the Biden administration, you see Democrats in Congress. It's one of their number one issues. And, it's also for Republicans. And you saw that now getting increasingly so with a lot of the speeches from the RNC convention in Milwaukee earlier this summer. So we have actually standardized a briefing process for Hill staff, for stakeholders, for other policy folks. And, our goal is to make sure that, they have a good background in labor policy. They know what free market labor policy, conservative labor policy looks like, and they're out there protecting those individual workers.
I may have to have a conversation offline with you about this to do the same thing on regulatory policy. Because, I'm listen, just by way of a side note here, I'm a firm believer in what one of my mentors told me about new organizations, that they have to, the acronym is SUM, S-U-M, they have to be strategic, they have to be unique, and and the work that they do has to be measurable. And that is certainly in that vein. I love this idea, standardizing briefings so that everybody's on the same page. So Vinnie, before I let you go, my listeners and viewers have heard me say this before. I was originally conceiving of doing a podcast that I was going to call Outside Interests, in which I was talking to folks in the political and policy world about their outside interests, because I think it helps humanize folks. And so folks understand that these folks are not very different from you and me. Talk a little bit about the things that interest you that don't have to do with politics and policy. When you're, when you're not at work, when you're on, your downtime, what are you up to, you and your family? I would love to hear, what's going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Andrew, I'll have to have you come out this way, get some barbecue. Love doing some good barbecue. We
Here.
Yeah, we enjoy that. So, like good food, like going swimming and kayaking when I have the ability. But I'll be honest, work, as you know, can be pretty time consuming, and it takes a big chunk of my time in my life. But I do love spending time with my wife and my kids. They're actually at a Chick-fil-A camp, if you can believe that's a thing right now.
Oh my goodness.
And
the left is going crazy over this Chick-fil-A camp because they think that it's free labor for Chick-fil-A. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I know they have them all over the country, but they're loving that, and we do a lot of daddy kid time as well.
And for those of you, and Vinnie's wife was in the movement. Is she still doing movement work, or is she not doing movement work anymore?
She's actually full-time homeschooling, and she is absolutely loving it. The kids are doing great, and I could not be more grateful.
Well, how do we all find out more about the Institute for the American Worker?
Sure. It's at i4aw.org. Once again, that's i4aw.org.
Well, Vincent Vernuccio, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me on.
And this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. As I said, if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms out there, you can check us out on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can go and check us out wherever fine podcasts are found. Tell your friends, your neighbors, your family friends, your friends of your family, subscribe, leave a review, et cetera, et cetera. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.